Hello and welcome to Guns and Gear. Just got finished making a video and showed you all a bunch of knives that I had sitting out on the deck there on the table. But it was starting to get a little bit dark and planes started flying over, and there was a young man out there, I think, that just got himself a new mini bike, and he was racing that thing up and down the street. And the noise began to be distracting to me, so I thought I'd move in and place some knives on the table and continue my conversation with you guys. With this video, I wanted to start talking about categories of cutting tools that we should consider to prepare for some sort of a survival scenario or whatever. If you look at early man, some of the very first tools that we made were cutting tools. Okay, they were made out of stone. And you look at some of those early examples of those cutting tools, and they were different sizes because they had different purposes. You may have seen a bigger rock that had been chipped away to have an edge on it because it had weight, it could chop. And maybe a smaller stone that had been cracked or something to get an edge on it for some cutting task, and maybe even a shard of a rock to go along with that could handle some finer tasks. That's some of the basic foundation of cutting tools that we have, and the way that I see it, those fundamentals haven't changed. When you look all through history, larger cutting tools, mid-sized cutting tools, small cutting tools were all essential and important. I like to read a little bit about the colonization of North America and the settlers, and those early frontiersmen, adventurers that wanted to go see what was over the next rise in this new land. And quite often they carried supplies with them, and quite often when you look at some of the tools and things that they had on their person, you would find more than one cutting tool. Maybe you'd find like a belt axe or a tomahawk, and along with that a hunter's knife, right? Which was a mid to large size knife that could handle a lot of chores, a lot of different cutting tasks. And then often you would find maybe in a pouch or something a much smaller knife, like a patch knife, right, that could handle some of the more delicate cutting chores. The way that I look at it is the ability to chop is important, but also just the ability to cut, to slice, to clean, to skin, and butcher game. All these other methods of cutting are equally as important. To be able to carve. Maybe you're making traps, maybe you're making tools so you don't have to carry them. Maybe you're making tools out of wood because they're lighter, like spoons and things of that nature. So all these things come to be a basic part of the essential equipment that you need to thrive in a wilderness situation. Look at the mountain men, and they were very much the same. They would have maybe a chopping tool like that tomahawk on there, and a hunting knife, medium to large size knife, and then a smaller knife. These were individuals that sometimes they traveled with groups, and they had pack trains of animals carrying stuff. But these were the items that they had on their person in case they were separated from, that they could make do. Right? So the idea of the survival knife, I'm opposed to. And the reason for that is this one tool option, people take it too far. Having a knife that has a lot of capability, there's no problem with that. I have no problem with that at all. But putting all your confidence, putting all your eggs into that one basket, I don't think is the prudent choice. I look at those mountain men, they were not much different than the early man, as they had a chopping tool, they had a general cutting tool, and then they had a smaller knife for finer work. All these things became important in helping them get by. I feel much the same today as those folks that were actually living in the woods and the knives and cutting the implements that they carried with them. I don't like to put all my eggs into that proverbial basket. To give you an idea, thought I would show you maybe an example of an individual who I enjoyed reading his work. His name was Nesmith, and his real name was, that was his pen name, his real name was George Washington Sears. And you know, there's, Google him, read about him, maybe get, you can still, some of his books are still available today, and he wrote them probably in the early 1900s. At any rate, he had this book that he had sketches of the items, the cutting items that he brought with him on his long trips. And mostly this was canoeing and backpacking. So he was having to carry these things. And weight was a concern to him. His belt knife, he liked to be that food processing knife, right? And a skinning knife. And this is a Nesmith inspired knife, very similar to the drawings. And this is made by Blind Horse Knives, and as you can see, this has a skinning profile. It's 1/8 inch steel, and I remember in that book he made mention that the knives of his time were too thick to be useful. And what he was talking about is that skinning is the smaller, more delicate tasks. And along with that, he had a two-bladed pocket knife that did most of his general cutting chores. And I think this would be a very good example of that. It says Titlewood on there. It's made by Great Eastern Cutlery, but Great Eastern Cutlery is the parent company to some smaller companies like Titlewood. And it's a trapper, which means it has a clip point blade. And instead of a spade blade, this one has more of a drop point blade. And one of the reasons that I liked it. And something very similar to this, I'm sure, would have met with Nesmith's approval to handle general cutting chores. For larger cutting, chopping chores, he liked a small double bit axe. And this is I think a pretty good representation. This is from Norland, and it's called a saddle cruiser. I hope Norland shows up there. And I've had this for quite a long time. Now the total length from the back side of the bits of the axe head to the handle is just shy of 18 inches. I think it's 17 3/4 or something of that nature. But at any rate, this meets that what Nesmith described. And these three tools were able to handle cutting and chopping and splitting wood. You know, the cool thing about a double bit axe is by design, one bit is much thicker than the other bit. So one bit could be used for digging around roots and chopping roots if you're trying to get some lighter wood from a blown over pine tree, for instance, or maybe to split wood, the thicker bit would be used, and then you had the thinner bit for chopping. And it's sort of like having two axes together at one, or in this case, two hatchets together at one. So there was another fellow out there, his name is Horace Kephart, and he liked a more utilitarian type of knife for his belt knife. And I did not pull that knife out, but I showed you in the video before a spear point knife from Gossman, which is a Horace Kephart inspired knife. It has a 5-inch blade, 1/8 inch construction of A2 high carbon steel. Once again, even though it's a good knife, it was of a thinner material. Today, really thick blades are in vogue, and I have some. And the only way that I can bring them to where I like them a lot is maybe removing some stock material from there to create a different profile. For instance, You know, this knife right here is the Aragnac ENIP -1, and this is a monster chopper. Would not be my first choice for cleaning a brim, right, or a perch. Another knife, very popular on YouTube, the Cookery, an outstanding chopping knife, right? Very thick material, very thick convex edge. But once again, for those medium and smaller tasks, this knife really is a struggle to make it do. Okay, and the Gurkha and the Nepalese people, maybe, if I'm saying that right, they realize the limitations of the Cookery, because often along in the sheath they'll have a smaller knife included for handling some of those finer tasks, and another little thing shaped like a knife that they use for sharpening. So even some of the indigenous people of a legendary knife like the Cookery realize the limitations of its ability. And that is a theme that I think that we need to think about, having more tools that complement one another. If you're going to have a hatchet or a big knife to do some chopping, also have a medium-sized knife that can fill the gap on some of the things that the bigger knife can't do as well. And then maybe even a pocket knife or something that can complement those other two knives and handle important tasks better than some of the bigger knives. And that's the way that I kind of look at things now. Folks like Nesmik had 3 tools. I have to admit that I add a 4th, and that 4th tool would be some sort of a saw, maybe a folding saw or a collapsible buck saw. I believe that it's worth the wait for the capability that it has. At any rate, another beginning conversation talking about cutting implements for survival. All right, I hope you found this somewhat interesting. At any rate, I appreciate you watching, and remember to shoot straight on the range and in life. Thanks.